There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It has clear sides. It has a moral direction. The uniforms tell you who the enemy is, and the timeline moves in a straight line from darkness toward liberation. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the parts that are missing were not lost by accident. They were filed away. They were reclassified. They were summarized into language so dry and procedural that the human content inside them became almost invisible. The war that actually happened was not a story of good against evil operating in clean separation. It was a war in which institutions on all sides developed systems, and those systems processed human beings with the same administrative logic that peacetime governments used to process tax records and land surveys. What follows is drawn from those systems, from the reports, the memoranda, the logistics chains, the after-action reviews, the internal cables, and the bureaucratic infrastructure that kept the war running at scale. None of it is invented. All of it was documented, and that documentation is, in its own way, the most disturbing part of the entire record. The first thing to understand is that the German bureaucracy that administered the Holocaust was not an improvised operation run by fanatics operating outside the state. It was the state, the machinery that identified, registered, transported, and ultimately killed millions of people, ran through the same ministries that issued driver's licenses and managed railway timetables. The Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, produced internal reports called Einsatzgruppen activity reports that read, in their structure and tone, like corporate quarterly summaries. The number of people killed in a given week was recorded in columns. Regions were listed. Totals were tallied. The language was passive and institutional. The reports did not describe horror. They described throughput, and they were filed, reviewed, archived, and distributed to senior officials who read them at their desks, annotated them in the margins, and passed them along through standard inter-office channels. The system was not hiding what it was doing. It was documenting it with the confidence of an institution that believed its own paperwork would never be used against it. One of those reports, covering operations in the Soviet Union during the summer and fall of 1941, tallied the killings of more than 500,000 people across a period of a few months. The report was drafted in Berlin. Copies went to Himmler, to senior SS commanders, to regional administrators. There is evidence that Hitler himself was briefed on the numbers. The language in the document does not shift. There is no hesitation in the phrasing. The killings are described using bureaucratic euphemisms, but the numbers are precise. And the precision is important because precision is the mark of an institution that has normalized what it is measuring. You do not keep careful records of something you believe is wrong. You keep careful records of something you believe is work. The mobile killing units that produced those numbers, the Einsatzgruppen, were composed in part of ordinary men. This is not a new observation, but the documentary record makes it impossible to soften. The personnel files of these units show that their members included lawyers, academics, a former opera singer, at least one theologian. They were not selected because they were uniquely violent. They were selected in part because they were educated, reliable, and capable of following complex instructions in unfamiliar environments. The after-action reports from their operations describe the logistics of mass shootings with the same attention to detail you would find in a military supply inventory. How many rounds were expended, how the sites were organized, what problems arose in the field and how they were resolved. The problems that were documented were logistical problems, problems of efficiency, problems of noise, of soil composition at burial sites, of the psychological strain on the men doing the shooting, which was addressed not as a moral concern, but as an operational one, because a shooter who was emotionally compromised was a shooter who was less accurate and less reliable. It was this last concern, the psychological sustainability of the men assigned to mass shootings, that partly drove the development of the gas vans and eventually the fixed extermination facilities. The decision to industrialize killing was made in part because the existing method was considered too difficult to sustain at the required scale without degrading the performance of the personnel involved. This is documented. It was discussed in internal memos. The concern was not for the victims. The concern was for the perpetrators, and specifically for the perpetrators as operational assets whose effectiveness needed to be maintained. The solution was to remove the perpetrators from direct physical contact with the killing, to mechanize the process, to build a system in which individual human beings could contribute to mass death without ever personally pulling a trigger or looking anyone in the eye. The architecture of the extermination camps was the physical expression of a bureaucratic solution to a bureaucratic problem. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 is sometimes described as the moment when the decision to exterminate European Jews was made. That framing is not accurate, and the actual documentary record is more disturbing than the popular version. By the time the 15 men gathered at the villa in Wannsee, mass killings were already underway on a large scale in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. What the conference was actually about was coordination. It was a meeting to ensure that all the relevant agencies of the German state understood their roles in a process that had already begun, and to resolve jurisdictional questions about which offices would have authority over which populations and in which territories. The minutes of the meeting, the Wannsee Protocol, are written in the same flattened administrative language as any other interagency coordination document. The murder of 11 million people is discussed using the phrase, "the final solution of the Jewish question," and related bureaucratic terminology. The participants discussed exemptions, edge cases, populations that fell into ambiguous categories, and how those cases should be handled. They discussed the logistics of deportation from Western European countries where German administrative control was exercised through local governments. They discussed the question of mixed-race individuals using clinical categories developed by racial scientists employed by the state, and then the meeting ended and the men returned to their offices and the work continued. What the Wannsee Protocol demonstrates is not that evil requires a dramatic moment of decision. It demonstrates that evil, operating at institutional scale, looks like a coordination meeting. It looks like men in suits resolving procedural ambiguities. It looks like a document that is circulated to the relevant departments and filed in the appropriate registry. The horror is not in the room. The horror is in the filing cabinet. The German railway system, the Reichsbahn, transported hundreds of thousands of people to the extermination camps over the course of several years. The Reichsbahn was not a Nazi organization in the ideological sense. It was a state enterprise, a railroad. It ran on schedules. It charged fares. It issued receipts. The SS paid the Reichsbahn standard third-class passenger rates for deportees, calculated on a per-head, per-kilometer basis. Children under 10 traveled at half price. Children under 4 traveled free. These are the actual billing arrangements that appear in the documented contracts between the SS and the Reichsbahn. The railroad administrators who processed these contracts were not, for the most part, members of the SS. They were railroad administrators. They negotiated rates. They managed rolling stock allocation. They processed invoices. The deportation trains operated within the ordinary scheduling and administrative framework of a national transportation network, slotted in around freight trains and military transports according to the availability of track time and locomotives. The Reichsbahn transported people to their deaths using the same organizational infrastructure it used to transport coal and timber, and it billed for the service at standard commercial rates. Local cooperation with the deportation process extended across occupied Europe in patterns that post-war national narratives have consistently minimized. In France, the Vichy government's police forces conducted roundups of Jewish families, including the notorious Vel d'Hiv roundup of July 1942, in which French police, not German soldiers, arrested more than 13,000 people, including more than 4,000 children in Paris, and transported them to a cycling stadium where they were held in conditions that killed some of them before deportation even began. The German occupation authorities had requested the roundup. The French police executed it. The paperwork authorizing the operation was generated by French administrative offices. The buses that transported people to the stadium were city buses, operated by the Paris Municipal Transport Authority, driven by French bus drivers who showed up for their shift and did their job. In the Netherlands, the level of administrative cooperation with German occupation authorities was, by the end of the war, high enough that the deportation rate of Dutch Jews was significantly higher than in countries with less cooperative local administrations. The Dutch Civil Registry, which maintained meticulous records of the population including religious affiliation, provided German authorities with information that made identifying and locating Jewish residents substantially easier than it would otherwise have been. Dutch civil servants maintained those records, updated them, and in some cases made them more accessible to German requests than their German counterparts had initially anticipated. The result was that approximately 75% of the pre-war Jewish population of the Netherlands was murdered, a proportion substantially higher than in Belgium or France, where administrative cooperation was less complete. These are not comfortable facts. They are not presented in most popular accounts of the war because they complicate the narrative of occupied peoples as unified victims of foreign aggression. The documentary record does not support that narrative in its simple form. What the record shows is a spectrum of complicity ranging from active participation to passive facilitation to deliberate ignorance distributed across civilian populations and administrative bodies throughout occupied Europe. The record also shows that German occupation authorities understood this spectrum and worked systematically to engage local institutions wherever possible, because local cooperation was more efficient than German-only operations. The entire system was designed to distribute responsibility so broadly that it became, in practical terms, invisible. No single person was responsible. Every person was only doing their part. Within the German military itself, the relationship between the regular armed forces and the atrocities of the Nazi regime was not the clean separation that post-war German military culture worked hard to establish. The Wehrmacht, the German regular army, was directly involved in crimes against civilians and prisoners of war on a scale that the post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht systematically obscured for decades. The Commissar Order, issued before the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, instructed German forces to summarily execute all captured Soviet political officers. This was not an SS directive. It was a Wehrmacht order, distributed through standard military channels, implemented by regular army units across the Eastern Front. Soldiers who followed the order were not acting outside the military chain of command. They were obeying it. Soldiers who refused faced potential disciplinary consequences, though the evidence suggests that outright refusal was rare and that the order was widely complied with. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war is one of the most systematically documented atrocities of the entire war, and one of the least discussed in Western popular accounts. Approximately 5.5 million Soviet soldiers were captured by German forces during the war. Of those, approximately 3.5 million died in German captivity, the majority of them within the first year of their capture. They died of starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate killing. The decision to allow Soviet prisoners to die was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate policy choices made at the highest levels of the German military and state. The Army's own quartermaster records show that rations allocated to Soviet prisoners were set at levels that were nutritionally incompatible with survival, and that this was known to the officials who set them. The decision was justified within the administrative framework by the argument that Soviet soldiers were not protected by the Geneva Conventions because the Soviet Union had not ratified them, which was technically true and completely irrelevant to the question of whether human beings could survive on the rations they were being given. The camps where Soviet prisoners were held in the winter of 1941 and 1942 were frequently not camps in any meaningful sense. They were open fields enclosed by wire. There were no barracks, there was no sanitation. Food deliveries were irregular and insufficient. Men froze to death in enormous numbers. German military documents from this period record the mortality statistics with the same flat administrative tone as the Einsatzgruppen reports. Numbers of prisoners received, numbers of deaths, numbers remaining. The bureaucratic category of prisoners remaining was the inverse of the mortality figure, and both numbers appear in the same column of the same forms, filed through the same channels, reviewed by the same officials. The German military's treatment of Soviet prisoners was documented in part because the German military documented everything. The paper trail is extensive. But the paper trail was also suppressed after the war with considerable effectiveness for several decades, partly because the Western powers that occupied Germany had strategic reasons to rebuild German military capacity for the emerging Cold War, and a German officer corps that had presided over mass atrocities was not a useful foundation for that project. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht was in some respects a Cold War administrative decision as much as a historical falsification. Moving to the Pacific Theater, the Japanese military's conduct in occupied territories produced its own extensive documentary record, portions of which were deliberately destroyed at the end of the war, and portions of which survived to become the basis for post-war legal proceedings and historical research. The Nanjing Massacre of 1937 to 1938, which preceded the formal beginning of World War II by several years, but is inseparable from the broader history of Japanese military expansion, is documented through a combination of Japanese military records, diplomatic cables from foreign nationals present in the city, photographic evidence, and the diaries of Japanese soldiers. The soldiers' diaries are particularly notable because they record, in first-person terms, participation in killings, sexual violence, and looting with a matter-of-factness that reflects the degree to which these actions had been normalized within the unit culture of the Imperial Japanese Army. The soldiers were not writing confessions. They were writing diary entries. The tone is reportorial. Things happened. They participated. They noted it down. The Japanese military's biological warfare program, Unit 731, operated in Japanese-occupied Manchuria from the early 1930s through the end of the war. The unit conducted experiments on human subjects, primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, involving plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other infectious agents, as well as frostbite, pressure experiments, vivisection, and weapons testing on living people. The scale of the program was substantial. Thousands of people died as direct subjects of experiments. The unit also produced biological weapons that were deployed against Chinese civilian populations, with documented outbreaks of plague and cholera in multiple Chinese cities tracing back to Unit 731 operations. What happened to the documentation of Unit 731 at the end of the war, and what happened to the scientists who ran it, is a significant chapter in the history of how wartime atrocities were processed by post-war institutional systems. As the war ended, American intelligence officials negotiating with the leadership of Unit 731 made a decision to offer immunity from prosecution in exchange for access to the experimental data the unit had accumulated. The reasoning was that the data, collected under conditions that American researchers could not replicate under peacetime ethical constraints, had potential military and medical value. The men who had administered a biological warfare program that had killed thousands of people through deliberate infection and experimental torture were given immunity, returned to civilian life in Japan, and in some cases went on to prominent careers in Japanese medicine and industry. The deal was classified. The data was transferred. The scientists were never prosecuted. American authorities actively worked to prevent Soviet access to the Unit 731 personnel and data, in part because the Soviets were conducting their own biological weapons research, and the American government did not want them to have the benefit of the Japanese program's findings. This is documented. The decision was made at senior levels of American military and intelligence command. The paperwork exists. The immunity arrangements are on record. The justification that was offered internally was that the data had scientific value and that prosecution would simply result in the information going to the Soviets instead of the Americans. The moral dimension of the transaction was noted in some internal communications and then set aside. The institutional calculus won. The men who had overseen experiments on living human beings were assessed as assets to be acquired rather than criminals to be prosecuted, and the machinery of post-war intelligence policy processed them accordingly. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been debated for 8 decades in terms of their military necessity and moral status. What is less commonly discussed is the institutional framework within which the decision was made, and the degree to which that framework excluded certain categories of consideration from the outset. The targeting committees that selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki from a list of candidate cities operated according to criteria that were explicitly defined to maximize the demonstration of the weapon's effects. Cities that had already been heavily damaged by conventional bombing were excluded from the target list because the ability to assess the impact of the new weapon would be compromised by pre-existing destruction. Cities with significant prisoner-of-war populations were noted as potential complications. The targeting process was meticulous. It was driven by a desire to produce clean, accessible data on what the weapon could do to an intact urban environment. The populations of the candidate cities were, in the framework of the targeting committee's deliberations, primarily significant as variables in a demonstration. This framing is documented in the records of the targeting committee's meetings. The language is technical and analytical. The question being addressed was not whether to kill civilians. The question was which configuration of target characteristics would produce the most useful information about the weapon's capabilities. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki appear in those documents as population density figures and building stock composition data. The committees were staffed by capable, educated men applying rigorous analytical methods to the problem they had been assigned. The problem they had been assigned did not include as a primary variable the moral status of killing the populations under consideration. The firebombing of Japanese cities that preceded the atomic bombings is, in terms of raw casualty figures, comparable to, or in some cases, exceeding the immediate death tolls of the atomic attacks. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80 to 100,000 people in a single night, primarily through the generation of a firestorm that destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. The planning documents for that operation, like those for the subsequent firebombing raids on other Japanese cities, describe the target selection in terms of industrial output, residential density, and the concentration of small manufacturing enterprises within residential neighborhoods, which were assessed as significant contributors to Japanese war production. The targeting criteria were, technically, industrial. The populations of the residential neighborhoods that contained those enterprises were not the stated target. They were the predictable consequence, which is a distinction that had meaning within the institutional framework of the air campaign's planning documents and essentially no meaning to the people who died. General Curtis LeMay, who directed the firebombing campaign, stated after the war that if the United States had lost, he would likely have been tried as a war criminal. This is one of the more candid post-war assessments offered by any senior American commander, and it contains within it an acknowledgement of something that institutional narratives of the war consistently obscure. The difference between a war crime and a military operation, at the level of strategic bombing campaigns, was determined in significant part by which side won. The laws of war as they existed in 1945 did not clearly prohibit the deliberate targeting of civilian populations through area bombing, in part because the major powers had collectively declined to develop legal frameworks that would constrain their own capabilities. The institutional gap between what was legally permissible and what was morally defensible was wide, and the major powers had deliberately kept it wide. The Allied strategic bombing campaign in Europe operated within the same institutional framework. The area bombing of German cities, which British Bomber Command pursued as a deliberate strategy of destroying civilian morale through the destruction of residential neighborhoods, killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians over the course of the war. The debate within the British government about the moral and practical justification for this strategy was real and documented. There were senior officials who raised objections, not primarily on moral grounds but on grounds of efficiency, arguing that the resources devoted to area bombing of cities could produce more militarily significant results if directed at specific industrial or transportation targets. The moral objections were present in the record, but they were secondary. The institutional decision-making process weighed effectiveness against effectiveness. The question of whether it was acceptable to kill large numbers of civilians was treated as essentially settled. Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, was a systematic, methodical administrator who believed in the strategic concept of area bombing and pursued it with consistent institutional energy. His correspondence and operational orders reflect a man who had internalized the destruction of German cities as a legitimate military objective and who assessed his progress in terms of the acreage of urban area destroyed. His metrics were built-up area devastated, industrial output disrupted, and what he referred to as dehousing, the destruction of worker housing as a means of disrupting industrial production. The human beings who had lived in those houses appear in his calculations primarily as a secondary variable, relevant because their displacement contributed to the disruption of the German war economy. Harris was not a sadist. He was a commander who had been given an objective and a methodology and who pursued both with professional competence. The institutional framework he operated within had determined that what he was doing was appropriate, and within that framework, he was doing it well. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 has attracted particular historical attention because it occurred at a late stage of the war, when German defeat was effectively certain, and because it destroyed a city that had significant cultural and historical importance. The casualty figures have been contested for decades, with estimates ranging widely, but the consensus of recent historical research places the death toll at somewhere between 22 and 25,000 people. The planning for the Dresden raid, like the planning for other area bombing operations, went through the standard institutional channels. Target selection committees evaluated the city's transportation significance, its role in east-west rail movements, and its status as an administrative center. The residential and cultural aspects of the city were noted and essentially irrelevant to the targeting decision. The raid was authorized, planned, and executed through the standard organizational machinery of the Allied air campaign, with the same procedural normalcy that characterized operations against cities that had less post-war symbolic weight. What the institutional record of the strategic bombing campaign reveals is not that the people running it were monsters. It reveals something in some ways more unsettling. It reveals that the systematic killing of civilians through deliberate destruction of residential areas had been normalized within the institutional culture of the Air Forces, prosecuting it to the point where it required no special moral justification at the individual level. The men who flew the missions, the men who planned them, the men who assessed the results and adjusted the target lists accordingly, were all operating within a framework that had answered the moral question in advance. The framework said this was warfare. It said the objective was to win. It said the methodology had been assessed and approved. Within that framework, doing your job well meant killing large numbers of civilians efficiently, and doing your job well was what professional military personnel were supposed to do. The treatment of Japanese Americans during the war represents a different kind of institutional process, one that operated entirely within the domestic legal and administrative framework of the United States. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the removal of persons, meaning Japanese Americans on the West Coast, from designated military areas. The order was drafted by the War Department and the Department of Justice. It was reviewed by the Attorney General. It was signed by the President. The subsequent internment of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them American citizens, was administered by a civilian agency, the War Relocation Authority, using standard government administrative procedures. People were given notices. They were required to register. They were assigned to assembly centers and then to relocation centers. Their property, which they were required to dispose of on short notice, was frequently acquired at a fraction of its value by neighbors and speculators who understood the leverage the forced removal created. The Supreme Court, in Korematsu v. United States, upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion orders in 1944. The majority opinion, written by Justice Hugo Black, acknowledged that the exclusion of an entire ethnic group from their homes was a serious restriction of individual liberty, but concluded that the military necessity argument provided sufficient constitutional justification. The dissenting opinions were sharp and documented the racial basis of the policy with considerable clarity. Justice Frank Murphy's dissent used the word racism explicitly and placed the exclusion in the context of the treatment of Japanese Americans as a group defined by ancestry rather than behavior. The majority opinion prevailed. The institutional machinery of the American legal system processed the internment of American citizens without constitutional objection at the level that mattered. The intelligence record available to the officials who made the internment decision is relevant here. The internal assessments produced by American intelligence agencies at the time of the decision did not support the claim that Japanese Americans as a population represented a significant security threat. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who was not known for reluctance to identify internal security threats, communicated to the Justice Department that he did not believe mass exclusion was necessary from an intelligence standpoint. Curtis Munson, an investigator who had been sent by the State Department to assess the loyalty of Japanese Americans on the West Coast in the months before Pearl Harbor, had produced a report concluding that the community was overwhelmingly loyal to the United States. That report existed. It was in the files. It was available to the officials making the decision. The decision was made anyway, based on a combination of racial assumptions, political pressure, and the institutional tendency of military commanders to eliminate potential variables from their operational environment by the most direct means available, regardless of the actual probability that those variables posed a genuine threat. The government's lawyers, in presenting the Korematsu case to the Supreme Court, knew about the Munson report and other intelligence assessments that undermined the military necessity argument. They did not present that information to the court. Decades later, the legal proceedings that eventually led to a formal government acknowledgement of this suppression determined that the government's lawyers had committed a fraud on the court. The institutional process of the Supreme Court had been manipulated by the institutional process of the executive branch, and the result was a constitutional precedent that validated the mass removal of American citizens based on their ancestry. The precedent stood formally unrepudiated as a matter of binding law for more than 70 years. The experience of African American soldiers in the United States Army during World War II was shaped by an institutional framework of segregation that was not incidental to American military policy, but central to it. The Army maintained separate units for black soldiers throughout the war, based on a combination of official policy and the informal but powerful institutional culture of the officer corps, a significant portion of which came from the American South and held views on racial hierarchy that were accommodated rather than challenged by official policy. The Army commissioned studies on the performance of black soldiers and units, and some of those studies produced data that contradicted the racial assumptions underlying segregation, showing comparable or superior performance in integrated or black-commanded units relative to segregated ones. Those studies were received, filed, and did not change policy during the war. The 771st Tank Battalion, the first black armored unit to see combat in the Army, served with Patton's Third Army from late 1944 and participated in some of the most significant armored engagements of the final phase of the European campaign. Patton's address to the unit before its first combat deployment is sometimes cited as an example of his willingness to work with black soldiers. The address was also one of the few times Patton publicly acknowledged that the unit would face additional obstacles within the Army itself, not just from the enemy. The official records of the 771st's performance were positive and consistent with the records of comparable white armored units. The Army's institutional response to that performance, in terms of recognition, promotion, and the drawing of policy conclusions from the unit's experience was substantially different from what white units with comparable records would have received. The Red Cross blood supply during the war was maintained as a racially segregated resource. Blood plasma donated by Black Americans was kept in separate storage and labeled accordingly so that white soldiers who required transfusions would not receive blood from black donors. The scientific basis for this policy was non-existent. Blood plasma is not racially typed in any medically relevant way. The Surgeon General of the Army, at the time the policy was implemented, knew this. The policy was implemented anyway, because the institutional pressure to accommodate racial preferences was stronger than the institutional pressure to follow the science. Men died on the basis of this policy, receiving no transfusion or a delayed transfusion in circumstances where timing was critical, because the administrative system had decided that the racial origin of blood plasma was more important than the survival of the patient. The question of what the Allied powers knew about the extermination of European Jews, and when they knew it, has been examined extensively in the documentary record, and the answers are not compatible with the post-war narrative of ignorance. By 1942, British intelligence had broken German communication codes and was reading internal German military and SS communications that described the mass killings in explicit terms. The information was in the hands of senior British officials. American diplomatic and intelligence channels were receiving consistent reporting from sources in Europe that described the same events. The Polish government in exile was actively attempting to alert the Allied governments and the public to what was happening, and their communications were received, read, and placed on file. The institutional response to this information was not to do nothing exactly. It was to assess what could be done in the context of existing strategic priorities and to conclude, consistently, that the answer was very little. The Allied war strategy was built around the concept of defeating Germany militarily, and the resources required to mount a military campaign that might have interdicted the deportation trains or destroyed the infrastructure of the extermination camps would have come at a cost to other operations. The decision not to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, which was debated internally in 1944, when the deportation of Hungarian Jews was producing an unprecedented rate of killing, was made on the grounds that the bombing accuracy required to target the specific lines could not be reliably achieved, and that the diversion of bomber resources from other targets was not justified. The operational rationale was real. The Auschwitz complex itself was visible on aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by bombers that overflew it on their way to synthetic oil facilities in the region, and the photographs show the gas chambers and crematoria. The photos were taken, they were interpreted. The analysts noted what they were looking at. The decision calculus that produced the conclusion not to bomb was not secret within the relevant bureaucracies. It was a considered institutional judgment made by people who had the information, who understood what it meant, and who concluded that it did not change the strategic framework they were operating within. The framing of the problem was military. The population being killed was a variable within that framing, but not the primary variable. The primary variable was winning the war. Winning the war was the objective that had been institutionally defined, and the institutions worked to achieve it. The people dying in the camps were dying at a rate that the relevant officials understood and documented, and the institutional conclusion was that military victory was the best and only practical response, which meant doing what was already being done, fighting the war, and waiting for victory to end what the war had started. This is the same institutional logic that was applied to the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed between 2 and 3 million people in British India, and which was substantially influenced by wartime British policy decisions regarding food exports and grain reserves in the region. The famine occurred within the administrative framework of British colonial rule. It was documented in official reports. The Viceroy of India communicated the scale of the crisis to London. Churchill's War Cabinet reviewed the situation and made decisions about food allocation that prioritized war supply chains over famine relief. The internal records of those discussions contain statements that are, by any measure, deeply callous. The institutional response was to treat the famine primarily as a logistical and political management problem rather than a humanitarian emergency requiring resource reallocation. The people dying of starvation in Bengal were administratively distant from the war's primary theaters, and the institutional attention was focused where the institutional priorities directed it. The use of chemical weapons in World War II is a chapter of the record that does not fit neatly into the standard narrative, because the standard narrative tends to note that chemical weapons were not used on the Western Front as evidence of a kind of restraint that distinguished the Second World War from the First. The picture is more complicated. Germany used chemical agents extensively against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, including mustard gas. The United States, Britain, and Germany all maintained very large stockpiles of chemical weapons, and all had active development programs throughout the war. The decision not to use them in Western Europe appears to have been driven primarily by a mutual deterrence calculation rather than by principled objection. Each side believed the other had the capability to retaliate in kind, and the assessment was that the military benefits of initiating chemical warfare would be outweighed by the costs of retaliation. The American stockpile of chemical weapons, including large quantities of mustard gas and phosgene, was present in the Mediterranean theater and was aboard ships in various ports. On December 2, 1943, a German air attack on the port of Bari in southern Italy struck a Liberty ship, the John Harvey, which was carrying a classified cargo of mustard gas bombs. The ship exploded, and the mustard agent contaminated the harbor and the surrounding area. Allied military authorities initially suppressed information about the chemical nature of the cargo in order to maintain the secrecy of the stockpile's existence, which meant that medical personnel treating the casualties from the attack did not initially know they were treating mustard gas exposure, and some patients died or suffered worse outcomes than they would have with proper treatment. The incident was classified for years after the war. The official account of the Bari attack initially omitted the chemical weapons element entirely. When the suppression of medical information that had cost lives became apparent in later investigations, the institutional response was to note the exceptional circumstances and to reclassify the relevant documents in ways that made access difficult for decades. The Japanese military's use of chemical weapons in China is documented extensively in both Japanese military records and in the records of the post-war International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Mustard gas, lewisite, and other agents were used against Chinese forces and, on numerous documented occasions, against civilian populations. The post-war tribunal addressed these uses in its proceedings, but in a manner that many historians have subsequently assessed as incomplete, in part because the tribunal's focus was shaped by Allied prosecutorial priorities that emphasized certain categories of Japanese conduct and gave less attention to others. The decisions about what to prosecute at the Tokyo Tribunal, like the decisions about what to prosecute at Nuremberg, reflected institutional choices about which facts would be entered into the official legal record and which would remain in the less visible archive of military intelligence and diplomatic reporting. The Nuremberg trials themselves, while representing a genuine and historically significant attempt to establish legal accountability for wartime atrocities, were also an institutional process shaped by the institutional interests of the powers that controlled them. The Soviet Union was a co-prosecutor at Nuremberg. Soviet prosecutors introduced charges related to the Katyn massacre, the killing of approximately 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals by Soviet security forces in 1940, attributing the killings to Germany. This was a deliberate falsification. The Soviet government knew it was a falsification. The Western Allied prosecutors knew, or had strong reason to believe, that the Katyn attribution was false. The charges were included in the indictment but were not pressed during the trial, in part because the evidentiary record did not support them, and in part because the political complications of a direct confrontation with Soviet dishonesty at the trial were assessed as outweighing the institutional benefits. The Katyn massacre was not addressed honestly in an official international forum until the Soviet government acknowledged responsibility in 1990. What the structure of the Nuremberg process also reveals is the principle that became known informally as victor's justice, a recognition that the laws being applied and the conduct being judged were defined and administered by the powers that had won the war. This does not mean that the judgments were wrong. The conduct that was prosecuted at Nuremberg was genuinely criminal by any standard. But the process also had systematic exclusions. The strategic bombing campaigns of the Allied powers were not prosecuted. The treatment of German prisoners of war by Soviet forces, which involved mortality rates that in some periods and locations approached those of German prisoner of war camps, was not prosecuted. The displacement and expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the war, which involved substantial violence and which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, was not prosecuted. The institutional process of Nuremberg drew the line of accountability in a location that excluded the conduct of the prosecuting powers and drew it there by the deliberate choice of those powers who designed the tribunal, defined the charges, and controlled the process. General Tomoyuki Yamashita was executed by the United States military in February 1946, following a trial before a military commission that established what became known as the Yamashita Standard, the principle that a commander is responsible for the conduct of troops under his command, even if he did not order or know about specific violations. Yamashita had commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines during the latter stages of the war, during which Japanese troops committed documented atrocities against Filipino civilians, most extensively during the Battle of Manila in early 1945. His trial was conducted over a period of about a month, used evidence of questionable admissibility, and was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene in a 6-2 decision. Yamashita was hanged. The Yamashita Standard has had a complex and contested existence in military law ever since, in part because the standard it established, if applied consistently, would expose American military commanders to liability for conduct that their own forces have engaged in subsequent conflicts. The military justice systems of all the major powers in World War II operated in ways that reflect the fundamental tension between accountability and institutional self-protection that runs through the entire record of the war. Soldiers from all sides were prosecuted for individual acts of violence against civilians or prisoners that fell outside the norms their own institution had established. The norms themselves, including the starvation of Soviet prisoners, the area bombing of cities, and the internment of civilian populations, were not subjected to institutional accountability because the institutions had authorized them. The line between prosecutable conduct and authorized conduct was drawn by the institutions themselves, in the institutional interest of those institutions, and the line was drawn in ways that consistently protected the authorizing authority while punishing unauthorized individual action. The paper trail of Allied logistics in the European theater includes extensive documentation of the food supply situation in the Netherlands in the winter of 1944 to 1945. A period known as the Hunger Winter or Honga Winter, during which approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians died of starvation. The immediate cause of the famine was a German embargo on food supplies to the Western Netherlands, implemented in part as a reprisal for a Dutch railway strike that had been called in support of the Allied Market Garden offensive. The Allied High Command was aware of the food situation in the occupied Netherlands from the fall of 1944 onward. The decision-making about whether and how to address it was filtered through the same institutional framework that handled all competing demands on Allied logistics in a campaign that was simultaneously fighting across France, Belgium, and Germany. The Dutch population's food supply was one variable among many, and it was weighted against operational priorities. The operation that eventually brought food to the starving Dutch population, Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound, in which RAF and USAF bombers dropped food parcels over Dutch cities in late April and early May 1945, required a negotiated ceasefire with local German commanders who agreed not to fire on the supply aircraft. That negotiation happened. The food drops happened. But they happened in the last weeks of the war, when German defeat was certain and local German commanders were already calculating their post-war circumstances. The timeline of the food drops relative to the timeline of the famine makes clear that the solution arrived after most of the deaths had already occurred. The American military's relationship with former Nazi scientists and intelligence officials after the war is documented in records that were classified for decades and are now substantially, though not entirely, available. Operation Paperclip, the program through which the United States recruited German rocket scientists, aerospace engineers, and other technical specialists from the defeated Reich, brought approximately 1,500 German scientists and their families to the United States under arrangements that required, in some cases, the sanitization of their personnel files to remove or minimize evidence of Nazi Party membership, SS membership, or involvement in programs that used concentration camp labor or conducted experiments on prisoners. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, was aware that the files of some recruits contained information that would have made them ineligible for immigration to the United States under existing law. The files were altered. The men came anyway. Wernher von Braun, who became the leading figure in the American space program and whose team developed the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon, had been a member of the Nazi Party and the SS and had managed the V-2 rocket production program, which used concentration camp labor under conditions that killed thousands of forced workers. The internal records of the Mittelwerk underground factory, where the rockets were produced, document the conditions and the mortality. Von Braun's post-war personnel file, as processed through Operation Paperclip, presented his history in terms that emphasized his technical contributions and minimized his organizational involvement with the slave labor program. He came to the United States, worked for the Army, eventually joined NASA, and became a figure of genuine cultural significance in the American space program. His past was not secret exactly. It was managed. The institutional apparatus of the post-war American state processed it in a manner that made it compatible with his continued usefulness. Reinhard Gehlen, who had headed German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, approached American forces at the end of the war with an offer to turn over his organization's extensive files on Soviet intelligence and military capabilities in exchange for personal immunity and institutional continuity. The offer was accepted. The Gehlen organization, as it became known, was essentially the wartime German intelligence apparatus against the Soviet Union reconstituted under American sponsorship, staffed to a significant extent by former German intelligence officers who had previously worked for the Third Reich and in some cases had operational histories that included collaboration with SS units engaged in mass killings. The Gehlen organization became the foundation for the post-war West German Intelligence Service, the BND, which it formally became in 1956. The documentation of this transition, including the known histories of some of the personnel involved, was available to American decision-makers and was assessed and set aside in the context of Cold War intelligence priorities. The war crimes trials that took place in the American, British, French, and Soviet occupation zones in Germany after Nuremberg processed thousands of cases through military commission systems that were themselves under enormous institutional pressure as the Cold War hardened and the occupation authorities began to plan for the transition to West German sovereignty. Sentences that had been handed down were reviewed and in many cases reduced or commuted, as the strategic environment shifted and the political utility of holding German officials accountable came into tension with the political utility of German cooperation. John McCloy, the American High Commissioner for Germany, issued a series of clemency decisions in 1951 that released or reduced the sentences of numerous convicted war criminals, including industrialists who had used concentration camp labor, military officers convicted of executing prisoners, and members of the Einsatzgruppen. The clemency decisions were made within an institutional framework that was simultaneously negotiating the rearmament of West Germany and West Germany's integration into the NATO alliance. The timing was not coincidental. The documentation of what happened to Holocaust survivors immediately after liberation is part of the war's record that receives less attention than the liberation itself. Many survivors who had been liberated from the camps were held in displaced persons camps for months or years, in conditions that were sometimes not substantially better than what they had come from in terms of crowding, food security, and sanitation. The Harrison Report, commissioned by President Truman and submitted in the summer of 1945, described the conditions in the displaced persons camps administered by American forces in Germany in terms that Truman described as deeply disturbing. Harrison found that many Jewish survivors were still being housed in former concentration camps, still wearing the clothing they had been given by the Germans, still subject to inadequate food rations. The institutional response to the Harrison Report was genuine and produced improvements in conditions, but the process of its production, the fact that an official report was needed to establish that survivors of the concentration camps should not continue to be housed in concentration camps, reflects something about how the institutional machinery processed the human aftermath of its own prior decisions. The legal status of stateless persons created by the war and its aftermath was managed through a new institutional framework, the post-war refugee and international law system, that was itself being constructed from the same legal traditions and by some of the same states that had failed to protect the people whose statelessness it was now addressing. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which established the modern framework for refugee protection, was drafted in the shadow of the war and represented a genuine institutional response to the failures it had exposed. It was also drafted in a manner that reflected the political interests and limitations of the states drafting it, including provisions that qualified and conditioned the protections it offered in ways that would become significant in subsequent decades when different populations sought refuge from different kinds of violence. The returning veterans of all the major combatant nations brought the war home with them in ways that the institutional frameworks for veterans' care were not designed to handle. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, but the condition it describes was documented throughout the war under different names: combat fatigue, shell shock, war neurosis, and the institutional response to it was shaped by the military's operational interest in maintaining fighting strength. Men who exhibited psychological symptoms of combat stress were frequently returned to the front after minimal treatment, because the institutional priority was to keep units at strength. The medical records of these cases exist in military archives and reflect an institutional understanding that what was happening to these men was a recognizable condition with predictable causes, combined with an institutional practice of managing that condition in ways that served operational rather than therapeutic goals. The German soldiers who surrendered to Soviet forces in the final stages of the war entered a prisoner of war system that reflected the accumulated institutional damage of 4 years of extreme violence on the Eastern Front and the specific character of Soviet military administration under Stalin. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were held in Soviet prisoner of war camps. Of those, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million died in captivity of malnutrition, disease, cold, and in some cases, deliberate violence. The mortality rate was substantially higher than in American or British prisoner of war camps, and the conditions were documented in both Soviet internal records and in the accounts of survivors. The Soviet prisoner of war system, like the German prisoner of war system for Soviet prisoners, was an administrative expression of the institutional devaluation of enemy life that the war had normalized on the Eastern Front. The men who died in Soviet camps after German surrender were dying in a system that processed them as a residual problem to be managed rather than as a population whose welfare required investment. The question of what distinguishes the conduct of the war's various participants at the institutional level rather than at the level of individual action or political ideology, is one that the documentary record forces open in uncomfortable ways. The difference between the German extermination program and the firebombing campaigns, or between the treatment of Soviet prisoners by Germany and the treatment of German prisoners by the Soviet Union, is not a difference in the category of institutional logic that produced those outcomes. The logic in all cases was the same. The institution had defined an objective. The institution had developed methods to achieve the objective. The methods had costs that fell on people who were outside the institution's scope of moral concern, as the institution defined it. The institution implemented the methods. The deaths that resulted were processed as outcomes, as statistics, as data in reports that were filed and reviewed and archived by people who were doing their jobs. The most precise statement that can be made about the institutional character of World War II is that it demonstrated the capacity of modern administrative systems to sustain morally catastrophic operations indefinitely across large geographic areas involving millions of participants at various levels of the chain of command, without requiring that any individual within the system make a decision that they themselves recognized as morally decisive. The system distributed decision-making broadly enough that each individual's contribution was, from their own perspective, procedural. They were following orders, processing paperwork, managing logistics, making recommendations, drafting reports, reviewing files, issuing authorizations, and each of these actions was the normal activity of their organizational role. The moral weight of the system's outputs was distributed across the system in portions too small to be clearly visible at any individual point. This is what the paperwork shows. Not monsters making monstrous decisions, but bureaucrats making administrative decisions within institutional frameworks that had already resolved the moral questions before the paperwork arrived on their desks. The category error that most distorts the popular understanding of World War II is the assumption that the scale of the violence reflects the scale of the malevolence, that because so many people died in such organized ways, there must have been an equivalent organizational intensity of evil directing it. The record suggests the opposite. The scale of the violence was a function of the efficiency of the systems, not the intensity of the individuals. What made the Holocaust possible was not that every participant was a committed ideological killer. What made it possible was that the administrative machinery was reliable. The trains ran. The paperwork was filed. The reports were accurate. The invoices were paid. The system functioned, and because the system functioned, it produced its outputs at scale with the reliability and consistency that any well-managed institutional process produces. The same administrative virtues that make a postal system deliver mail reliably, or a hospital system process patients efficiently, were the administrative virtues that made it possible to process millions of people into the extermination program without the system breaking down. Reliability, consistency, attention to detail, procedural obedience. The individuals who kept those systems running went home after work. Some of them had families. Some of them struggled with what they were part of, and those struggles appear in diaries and letters that are now archived in various repositories of wartime documentation. Some of them did not struggle with it in any way that left a documentary trace. They filed their reports, went home, ate dinner, and came back the next day. The work continued because it was work, and work continued because work is what institutions do. And when the war ended, the institutional machinery was assessed for what could be retained, what could be repurposed, what could be quietly disbanded without accounting for what it had done. And the work of assessing and repurposing and disbanding was itself conducted through institutional processes, by people following procedures, filing reports, making decisions that would be reviewed and archived, and in many cases classified in ways that would keep them from public scrutiny for decades. The war ended. The systems that had enabled it did not disappear. They were reformed, reorganized, and in many cases preserved in modified forms by the same post-war institutional architecture that prosecuted some of their participants and recruited others. The legal frameworks that had been insufficient to prevent the war's atrocities were revised, and the revised frameworks were administered by states whose institutional interests shaped the extent and limits of the revision. The classified files were sealed. The operational records were archived. The personnel moved on to other posts, other institutions, other administrative roles, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had been part of, which most of them did not speak of because speaking of it served no institutional purpose, and they were, above all, institutional people. The last transport train carrying Jewish deportees to Auschwitz arrived at the camp in early November 1944. By that point, the Soviet army was advancing, and the German administrative apparatus was beginning its efforts to destroy evidence of what had occurred. The gas chambers at Auschwitz were dismantled by prisoner labor under SS supervision, and the crematoria were demolished. The demolition was ordered, managed, and documented through the same administrative channels that had ordered and managed and documented the original construction. The records of the demolition, like the records of the construction, went through the standard filing process. Some of those records survived because the advance of Soviet forces was faster than the German administration's ability to destroy everything. What survived is what was not destroyed, and what was not destroyed is a function of which administrative units had time to carry out their destruction orders, and which did not. The historical record of the extermination program is the record of what the perpetrators did not manage to burn.